want to tell you about the night I got my wig caught in a chandelier. Picture this. It's Halloween. A gay Halloween party. Which means that the costume stakes were not merely high, they were existential. At a straight Halloween party, you can show up in a sheet with 2 holes cut in it and someone will call it a costume. At a gay Halloween party, that sheet had better be a very high thread count, and those holes had better be intentional. My first lover, Tony, and I had decided on a couple's costume for our very first Halloween together, which, as any couple will tell you, is either the most romantic idea you will ever have or the beginning of an argument. Sometimes both, sometimes in the same evening. Tony was, and I want to be very precise about how I describe him, a dead ringer for Aldo Ray. If you don't know who Aldo Ray is, Google him immediately, and you will understand everything you need to know about my romantic life. Big, barrel-chested, magnificent raspy voice, and a mustache you could set your watch by. He was handsome in a thoroughly masculine way, and sexy in a way that had no business being as effective as it was. Tony came as Frankenstein's monster. Not the lumbering, flat-topped Universal monster of the Saturday matinees. No, Tony's monster was refined. He wore a maroon velvet top hat with a matching cummerbund. Big bushy mustache, sassy neck bolts. He looked like the monster had spent his time between films discovering haberdashery and had never looked back. I, of course, came as the bride. Black bedazzled leotard, fishnet hose, tattered red skirt, and a sassy red lace cape. And let's not forget the wig, the full Elsa Lanchester production. White street bouffant towering above everything else. Between the platform boots and the hair, I was approximately 8.5 feet tall. We looked magnificent, and we knew it. We walked into that party like we owned the dump, and my wig immediately got snagged in the hallway chandelier. Tony, my monster, my Frankenstein, my maroon velvet daddy, reached up without a word and gently freed my bouffant from the crystal cage. He was gallant to the last. It was, all things considered, a very good entrance. Here's what that story is actually about. Not Tony, not the chandelier, not even the wig, magnificent as it was, but it's about the fact that 2 gay men, one of them old enough to have lived through things I can barely imagine, one of them young enough to be furious on his behalf, walked into a room dressed as monsters and felt for an evening entirely, completely at home. Horror has always done that for us. Not horror as a genre, but horror as a space. A permission structure. A place where the wrong kind of body, the wrong kind of desire, the wrong kind of person could walk in and find, against all reasonable expectation, that the monsters would understand. This episode is about the specific men, the actors, the icons, the figures who haunted the screens of a particular generation of gay boys, who were doing something to us that nobody was naming out loud. Something that lives somewhere between admiration and desire and identification and a fourth thing that doesn't have a clean word attached to it just yet. We all know the names: Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Paul Naschy, the horror icons who made us feel something we didn't have a language for, in films that our parents probably shouldn't have let us watch, late at night, in the dark, exactly where we needed to be. This is not a nostalgia episode. I'm not here to make you feel warm about your childhood or mine. I'm here to make an argument, and the argument is this. Classic horror was one of the few places in mid-20th century culture that was accidentally, systemically, and sometimes deliberately doing something queer. Not inclusive queer. There's a difference. Inclusive means you're allowed in the room. Queer means the room was built for people like you, whether anyone intended it or not. The horror icons didn't set out to speak to gay boys specifically, but gay boys were certainly listening. And some of us are still listening to this day. And this episode is about why. Also, there will be werewolves, but we'll get to those later. Let me tell you what I mean when I say horror gave us something. I don't mean representation. I want to be clear about that up front, because representation is a word we reach for now, and it's not the right word for this. Representation is the Hallmark Channel making a Christmas movie with 2 gay leads. Representation is visibility, inclusion, the careful management of who gets to appear on screen and in what context and with what level of threat to the existing order. Horror wasn't doing that. Horror in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and even to the 60s, horror was not sitting down in a writer's room asking how it could better serve the queer community. Nobody was that thoughtful. Nobody was that progressive. And frankly, if they had been, it probably wouldn't have worked half as well. What horror was doing was something much older, stranger, and considerably more useful. Horror was putting figures on screen who were wrong. Wrong in their bodies, wrong in their desires, wrong in their relationship to polite society. Wrong in every way that the culture around them had decided mattered. And then, and this is the part that counted, it was making those figures magnetic, dangerous, intelligent, desirable. It was asking you to find them compelling, and then, depending on the film, punishing you for doing exactly that. For a gay boy watching in the dark, and there were a lot of us watching in the dark in the years before there was anything else to watch, that was not an uncomfortable experience. That was a very familiar one. The monster was always the outsider. We knew that already. We'd been living it. But here's what horror added that nothing else was offering. The monster wasn't just wrong. The monster was magnificent in its wrongness. The monster had presence. The monster had style. The monster walked into a room, or floated through a wall, or descended a staircase in a cape, or emerged dripping from a swamp, and the room reorganized itself around them. That was new information. For a lot of queer kids, that was the first piece of evidence they'd ever had that being the wrong kind of person in the room didn't necessarily mean being the least powerful one. Horror didn't teach us to be proud. It's not that simple, and I'm not going to tell you it is. But it taught us something that came before pride, something more animal and more necessary. It taught us that the thing that made you monstrous could also be the thing that made you formidable. That's the argument. Everything else in this episode is evidence. So, why horror specifically? I mean, why not melodrama? Why not crime fiction? Why not the Western, which God knows has its own complicated relationship with masculinity and desire? Why did horror become the place where this particular thing happened, with this particular consistency for this particular audience? The answer starts, as so many things do, with a bunch of powerful men deciding what other people were allowed to feel. In 1934, the Motion Picture Production Code, known as the Hays Code, after the man who administered it, came into full enforced effect across all of Hollywood. And what the Hays Code did, in its infinite wisdom, was attempt to remove desire from American cinema. Sex, transgression, moral ambiguity, the suggestion that people who did wrong things might be interesting or attractive, or might not be adequately punished for their wrongness by the final reel. It banned specifically and explicitly any positive depiction of homosexuality. Any depiction. In fact, the word it used was sexual perversion. The code was not subtle. Now here is what the men who wrote the Hays Code did not understand about desire. You cannot legislate it out of existence. You can drive it underground. You can make it speak in code. You can force it to find new rooms, new languages, new faces to put itself on, but you cannot make it stop. And the room it found, one of the rooms it found, was horror. Horror was operating under the same code as every other genre, but horror had something the other genres didn't. Horror had a built-in excuse. Horror was already in the business of depicting the wrong kind of body, the transgressive impulse, the figure who existed outside the moral order. That was the entire genre. You couldn't make a vampire film without a vampire, and a vampire was by definition everything that the Hays Code disapproved of. seductive, amoral, predatory, undying, and absolutely convinced of his own superiority to the people around him. The censors were watching for sex. They weren't always watching for what else was in the room. And what was in the room was Dracula. Dracula is the foundational queer-coded figure in American horror cinema, and I will die on that hill with a stake through my heart if necessary. Think about what Dracula actually is. He's a foreigner, an Eastern European aristocrat arriving uninvited into respectable English society. He doesn't eat the food, he doesn't keep normal hours. He has a particular interest in young people who haven't yet settled into their prescribed social roles. He enters your bedroom while you sleep. He makes you want things you didn't know you wanted and weren't supposed to want. And once he's had you, you are changed. You cannot go back to what you were before. If you wrote that character today as a metaphor for queer awakening, you would be accused of being too on the nose. But Dracula wasn't alone. The entire Universal monster cycle of the 1930s and 40s was running on the same engine. Outsider figures of transgressive power arriving in spaces that couldn't contain them, making the respectable world deeply uncomfortable and secretly thrilled. The Mummy, the Wolfman, the creature from the Black Lagoon, a being who desires to cross the boundary of the possible and is destroyed for it. And the men who played these figures, the actors who inhabited them, who gave them voice and presence, and a particular quality of dangerous intelligence, were doing something in front of the camera that the Hays Code had no mechanism to stop. Because you can ban a kiss, you can mandate a punishment, you can insist that sin be seen to be punished by the closing credits. But you cannot ban a voice. You cannot legislate away the way a man holds himself in a doorway. You cannot write a code that prevents an actor from being, in some quality that lives below the level of plot, exactly the kind of wrong that a gay boy in the dark needed to see. That's what the icons were doing. That's why it worked. Which is exactly what we're going to talk about next. I want to start with the voice. Not the face, not the body, the voice. Because I think the voice is where it started for most of us, and I think we don't talk about it enough. There's a particular register that certain men in horror cinema occupied. A register that sat somewhere between authority and amusement, between absolute confidence and the very faintest suggestion that they found you slightly beneath them and were charmed by you anyway. A voice that said, I know something you don't. I have always known something you don't. And I have been waiting with considerable patience for you to be ready to find out what it is. Vincent Price had that voice. Vincent Price had that voice the way other men have a heartbeat, involuntarily, continuously, as a basic condition of being alive. That warm, impossibly precise baritone, the diction that belonged to a different century, the delivery that managed to be simultaneously completely sincere and utterly aware of its own absurdity, and delighted by both conditions equally. Price made over 100 films. A significant number of them are, by any objective measure, not good. It didn't matter. Vincent Price could make a film about a man haunted by a giant telepathic wasp seem like a reasonable way to spend an afternoon. He brought to every frame he occupied a quality of total, unapologetic commitment, combined with an absolute refusal to be embarrassed by anything. That combination, commitment without embarrassment, is one of the most specifically queer qualities I can name. We know it when we see it. We've been practicing it our entire lives. He was also, and this matters, a genuinely sophisticated man. An art collector, a cook, a wit. The campness was not a performance layered over an empty interior. It was an expression of a fully inhabited self. Gay boys are very good at detecting the difference. Camp and intellect and elegance and morbidity, all at once. razor cheekbones and velvet menace, and the particular trick of making intelligence itself seem like something you'd want to get closer to. Films like House of Wax, Masque of the Red Death, The Abominable Dr. Phibes, Gothic thirst traps for people with tastes. I said that, and I'm not taking it back. Christopher Lee is on the other side of the same coin, and the contrast is instructive. Where Price was warm, Lee was cold. Where Price invited you in, Lee made you come to him. Standing 6'4" with a physicality that was not merely imposing but architectural. The man didn't enter rooms, he occupied them, the same way a cathedral occupies a city block. Oh, and that voice. Lower than Price's, less ornamented, doing far less work to achieve far more. A rich, booming bass. What people who study these things call a horror bass. With a vocal range of something close to 3 octaves. He could have been an opera singer. He chose to spend it telling you what was going to happen to you in the dark. Lee's voice didn't seduce you into anything. It simply informed you of what was going to happen, and left the seduction as an exercise for your imagination. Horror of Dracula in 1958 may be the sexiest Dracula ever filmed. More sexual charge in one doorway scene than half of modern streaming manages across an entire series. And all of it technically within the censorship guidelines of the period. The women in those films don't scream when Dracula comes for them. They open the window. There's a reason for that, and the reason is Christopher Lee. And the reason that reason worked on gay boys as well as straight ones is that desire, that specific and that dangerous, doesn't actually care very much about the gender of the person watching. It just needs you to be paying attention. And we were paying attention. Next up, Paul Naschy. If Price and Lee are the aristocracy of this argument, Paul Naschy is something earthier and in some ways more honest. Spain's werewolf king. Hairy-chested, brooding, tragic, a bear icon before the language existed. Now, some of you will know exactly who I'm talking about, and some of you won't, and that's fine. And I'm going to fix that right now, because Naschy is one of the great underseen figures in horror history, and the fact that he's not as well known outside of Spain as he deserves to be is frankly an injustice I take personally. Where Price seduced you with wit and Lee seduced you with cold authority, Naschy did it with naked feeling. He wrote his own films, played his own monsters, and brought to the entire enterprise a level of physical commitment and open emotional availability that was almost bewildering in its sincerity. Naschy played the werewolf Waldemar Daninsky in exactly 12 films. 12! The same character across different stories, different centuries, different curses, different doomed love affairs. Each time Daninsky transforms, each time the wolf takes over, each time the body betrays the man inside it, Naschy plays it as tragedy. Not horror, but tragedy. The werewolf as a man who cannot stop being what he is, no matter how much it cost him and the people around him. That's the argument. Price, Lee, Naschy. 3 men, 3 registers, 1 consistent truth underneath all of it. The monster was always doing something to us. And now I want to talk about the specific monster that did the most. I want to talk about werewolves. Not vampires, not the elegant, aristocratic, sexually coded vampire we just spent all that time talking about, not Dracula in his cave descending the staircase, not the monster of intelligence and voice and dangerous refinement. The other one. The hairy one. The one on the floor. Yeah, the werewolf is a different kind of horror figure. A categorically different one. And I think it speaks to a categorically different kind of queer experience. One that doesn't get discussed as often as the vampire. Possibly because it's harder to make glamorous, and possibly because what it's actually about makes people slightly more uncomfortable. The vampire is about desire that transgresses. The werewolf is about a body that betrays. Think about what the werewolf story actually is. stripped of all its mythology and moonlight. It's a man, and it's almost always a man, who has something inside him that he cannot control, cannot hide, and cannot stop. Something that emerges whether he wants it to or not, that transforms him into a version of himself that is more physical, more animal, more driven by instinct than reason. Something that the people around him fear. Something that he fears in himself. And here's the thing about that story. It's told almost invariably as tragedy. Not as liberation, as tragedy. The werewolf doesn't want to be what he is. The werewolf is ashamed of what he is. The werewolf spends the parts of the film where he's human, trying desperately to find a cure, a solution, or a way to make the thing inside him stop. If that sounds familiar, it should. Lon Chaney Jr. understood all this, not just as an actor making choices. I think he understood it in his bones, as a man who had his own complicated relationship with things he couldn't control. His Larry Talbot, the Wolfman, across 5 films at Universal, is one of the most genuinely pathetic figures in horror cinema. And I mean pathetic in its original sense, full of pathos, worthy of feeling something for. Talbot doesn't want to hurt anyone. Talbot is appalled by what he does. Talbot is destroyed repeatedly by the gap between who he is in the daylight and what he becomes when the moon rises. Chaney played that gap with a heaviness that never felt like performance. It felt like weight he was actually carrying. And gay boys watching Larry Talbot tear himself apart over something he couldn't help being, we understood that weight. We had our own version of it. We've been carrying it since we were old enough to know we were carrying something. And then there's Oliver Reed, the patron saint of hairy horror men. Curse of the Werewolf in 1961 is ground zero for what I'm talking about. Reed was 22 years old. That jaw, that chest, that quality of barely restrained energy that made you feel the restraint was costing him something considerable. That at any moment he could either kiss you or kill you, and possibly both simultaneously. Sweaty, feral, brute force charisma. A man assembled specifically to make other people nervous. His Leon is a werewolf because he was conceived in violence and born on Christmas Day, which the film presents as a cosmic wrongness, an original sin he had no hand in and cannot escape. Reed plays Leon's transformation not as power, but as anguish. The werewolf is not a release. The werewolf is a punishment. And yet, and this is the Reed paradox that I suspect is at the heart of why he resonated with queer audiences, the werewolf is also the most fully alive version of Leon that we see on screen. The human Leon is suppressed, controlled, desperately trying to be what the people around him need him to be. The werewolf Leon is terrible and magnificent and completely, catastrophically himself. There's a reason that story spoke to us, and I don't think I need to explain it in detail. Paul Naschy, and I did promise we'd come back to him, understood the werewolf and his tragedy better than almost anyone. 12 films as Waldemar Daninsky, 12 times cursed, 12 times in love with a woman who might save him, 12 times failing, or being saved too late, or saving himself at the cost of everything else. Naschy wrote those scripts himself. He chose to keep coming back to that character across decades because he understood something about Daninsky that kept needing to be said. The werewolf who cannot be cured, the man whose love is real but whose nature keeps destroying what he loves, the body that will not cooperate with the life the person inside is trying to build. He told that story 12 times. Which brings me to something I'm going to say plainly and without apology. Werewolves are proto-furries. I'll wait. I understand that some of you will have feelings about this statement, but I stand by it. The furry community, and I say this with complete affection and zero mockery, has simply made explicit what horror cinema was encoding implicitly for 70 years. The human who becomes animal. The body that transforms into something larger, hairier, more physically present, more driven by appetite. The shame and the thrill existing in the same moment. The community built around a particular relationship to embodiment that mainstream culture finds baffling and faintly threatening. The Wolfman was already doing this. We just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. And the bear community, which I can't speak to with some personal authority, has its own complicated and affectionate relationship with this particular archetype. The big, physical, hairy man who is more comfortable in his body than he is supposed to be. The man whose appetites are not apologized for. The man who takes up space and considers this a feature rather than a fault. Horror understood that man long before the rest of culture caught up. Horror gave him a mythology. Horror made him tragic and magnificent in equal measure, and let us work out our feelings about him in the dark, in the safe space of fiction, before we had the language or the community to work them out anywhere else. Horror was mapping the territory decades before anyone had words for it. The werewolf was always one of us. We just took a while to admit it. I've been in love with werewolves my entire life. Not as a metaphor, not as a critical framework, not as a useful argumentative device for a podcast episode about queer horror icons, though it has turned out to be all those things, and I'm not ungrateful. I mean that as a child, watching Saturday afternoon creature features in Allendale, South Carolina, with the blinds drawn against the heat and a bowl of something I shouldn't have been eating, I watched Larry Talbot transform on that screen and felt something I couldn't name and didn't try to. I just felt, and I came back for more. Lon Chaney Jr., Oliver Reed, Paul Naschy, my beloved Dark Shadows werewolves, Chris Jennings and Quentin Collins. Sad, hairy, doleful creatures. Every single one of them. And I have spent the better part of my life absolutely convinced that I could cure them. With patience, with love, with a specific quality of attention that I have always brought to things I find both beautiful and broken. I would sit with Larry Talbot in those long nights before the full moon. I would find the answer Paul Naschy couldn't find across 12 films. I would be the person Oliver Reed's Leon needed, steady enough to hold him, brave enough not to flinch. I understand that this is not a realistic therapeutic strategy. I understand that in the films, the women who try to do this do not generally fare well. I have never let it stop me feeling it. Tony, my monster, my maroon velvet Frankenstein, the man who freed my wig from the chandelier with grace of someone who has been doing gallant things his whole life. Tony was 20 years older than me. His generation and mine had different relationships to being out, to being visible, to the question of what it cost to exactly be who you were in public. He had paid costs that I hadn't been required to pay. He had learned survivals I hadn't needed to learn. But we both grew up watching the same monsters. His monsters and my monsters came from the same films, the same late nights, the same darkened rooms where something on the screen was doing something to us that we didn't have a clean name for. The same figures of transgressive power and doomed desire and magnificent wrongness. The same sad, beautiful, hairy creatures that neither of us could save and both of us loved anyway. Horror gave us that. Before it gave us anything else. Before community, before language, before the hard-won vocabulary of who we were and what we wanted, it gave us that. A shared mythology. A set of figures to project onto and identify with and desire and mourn. A permission structure for feeling things that the rest of the culture was telling us very firmly not to feel. Tony and I walked into that party as a monster and his bride. We were, now that I think about it, doing what queer people have always done with horror. We were making it ours. We were finding ourselves in the wrong kind of story and deciding that the wrong kind of story was exactly right for us. And my wig got caught in the chandelier, and my monster reached up and set me free. And we walked into that room, 8 feet tall and completely at home. That's the whole thing right there. That's what horror gave us. I want to say something directly to anyone listening to this podcast who is of a certain age. Not my age, but older. There's bound to be a few. The generation that came before mine, the men who grew up in the 40s and 50s and 60s, who came of age before Stonewall, before the vocabulary existed, before there was anything remotely resembling a support structure for being exactly who you were, those men watched the same monsters we watched. They sat in the same darkened rooms. They felt the same things we felt, in the same wordless, nameless way, with considerably less hope that the feelings would ever lead anywhere safe. And they survived. A remarkable number of them survived, and built lives, and found each other, and made communities out of almost nothing. Without the language, without the visibility, without anyone telling them that it was going to be all right. Tony was one of those men. He never made a big thing of it. That was his generation's way, to carry what they carried without making it a performance, without asking for credit, without requiring that the people around them understand the full weight of what it had cost. They had learned a particular kind of dignity in the absence of support, and I think we owe it to them to notice that, to name it, to not let it get quietly buried. Because things being better now does not retroactively reduce how hard it was then. It hasn't. It was hard. It cost people everything in some cases. And the men who came through it did so largely alone, with whatever they could find to hold on to. Some of them held on to horror. Some of them held on to the monster on the screen who was wrong in all the right ways, who was magnificent in his wrongness, who walked into the room and commanded it and was destroyed by the end of the film, but was so completely terrifying alive while he was in it. I think that mattered. I think it was one of the things that kept people going in the years before there was much else to keep them going. I'm not prepared to call it a small thing. And to anyone younger who's listening, anyone who is in the early part of working out who they are and what they want and what all of this means, the monsters are still there, the room is still dark, and you are still allowed to feel whatever you feel in it, without apology, without explanation, without waiting for someone to tell you it's permitted. It was always permitted. Horror knew. Horror knew before anything else did. This has been episode 4 of Baz to the Bone. The show is called He Made Me Gay, the horror icons who did something to us. If you've made it this far, I hope it did something to you too. If you want more of this, more horror, more cult films, more bad taste done properly, you can find the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple Podcasts, a review takes 30 seconds and genuinely helps more people find the show. If you want to support what we're doing here, Patreon is at patreon.com/BazToTheBonecast. The link is in the show notes, along with every film and every figure mentioned in this episode. Episode 5 is Night of the Living Dead. George Romero, 1968. A black man is the hero of a horror film that was made for nothing, that changed everything. And a personal story about growing up in a town that didn't finish integrating until I was already in it. That one's going to require some care, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm Baz Bishop. Horror, cult film, bad taste done properly. Now tell me something.